All right, we're recording. This is the Service APIs meeting for August 6th. We've got lots to get through, but if there's something that isn't on the agenda right now that you'd like to discuss, please go ahead and add it. We may have some time at the end to follow up with that. To get started, I'll go ahead and take another look at the V1 Alpha 1 release checklist. We are still hoping, I'm still hoping to get a alpha release out this month. We are in August now, and I had August as a goal here. We've made some good progress over the past week. I know Harry has done some great work for both TLS config and routing. We'll cover a little bit on the advanced routing section today, and maybe even some follow-up on TLS. Bowie is working on service level config, and I've been working on conflict handling semantics. I should really add a link here. There's a big doc that could always use feedback. And James has volunteered to help clean up status and conditions. So that's where we are. We got a couple new things over into the completed section in the past week. And hopefully we can keep that momentum up and get a couple more over in the coming week. So that's an update on where we are. Hopefully we're still on track to get this a alpha release out in August. But at the very least, I think we're making some good progress here. The other thing of note is I know last week I discussed the idea of a API review doc where we basically had our full API spec and made it easy to give feedback over the full API instead of the little, we've been working for a while now on incremental updates, which has been good and helpful for us, I think, but I think it would be helpful to step back a second and look at the whole API all over again and try to see if there's things we've added that we don't need or don't make sense, or if there are large gaps in the API. So part of the purpose of this doc was for ourselves to review what we've done from a higher level and understand any gaps there may be. But I also wanted to have this doc available for anyone in the community who's interested in reviewing our API before we commit to an alpha release, to be able to review the whole API in one chunk instead of reviewing the little PRs we have as they come in. So that was the motivation for this doc. Please go ahead and add comments, add anything you might think to this if you see things that don't make sense or we should clean up. So far, I've just added some comments for typos or grammatical things, but I'm sure there are other things in here that could use feedback. I'm also planning on sharing this with the broader SIG network community so that we can get some broader API review. I know Tim is interested in doing a full API review on this. And just before we get to that alpha release, I'd like to make sure that we've got some more community buy-in and also broader API review. So that's the motivation here. I think we'll get some good feedback out of this. And I know it is going to be a pain to keep this up to date with master, with what's in GitHub, but I will try to keep it up to date every day or two. And I've volunteered to maintain this myself. And there is a last updated date here in case you're curious how up to date it is. Yeah, so that is my goal with this doc, and I plan on sharing it in the SIG network meeting later today. All right, so with that background, well, before I go any further, are there any questions regarding either V1 Alpha 1 release timeline or that API review doc? Great. Okay. Uh, we briefly had some time to cover this yesterday in office hours, but there's a lot more that needs to be discussed as far as this initial implementation of route filtering from Harry. So I guess I'll hand it over to Harry to provide a bit of background here. And yeah, if there's anything you want me to highlight in here, let me know, Harry. And I don't know if you're trying to talk, Harry, but you are muted right now.
I'm sorry. Okay.
No
Uh,
problem. Yeah.
Thanks, Rob. So this is part of the advanced routing proposal. This is the biggest chunk in that proposal, which covers areas as traffic splitting, traffic mirroring, doing, more advanced stuff like, which are specific to implementation things like, adding in support for, authentication or logging, things like, concerns that are primarily performed at the gateway layer, and the features which are shipped, in cloud vendor gateways implementations, as well as gateway providers who sell these features, and open source implementations as well. So the route filter is intended as a sort of a extension point from where we can add in some core filters and some custom implementations. So the idea here is the route filter is the filters are part of the API specification, and then uh, you can use the filtering to extend for custom implementations. And as we see convergence happening around some specific implementations, we'll pull those into the core API and have conformance testing for those. So if we scroll down here, you can see that the route filter here is part of the HTTP route rule resource, which means these filters are executed whenever there is a match. So whenever there is a match and this rule is being executed, these filters are executed. Um, so these could be, like adding headers or removing headers, or this could be, adding authentication or something like that. Ye had as a comment that we would call these actions. That's true. The proposal did calls for an action. I sort of figured it would be better to route it HTTP route filter, because I think Daniel already had that in the master branch, and we already had an action verb action attribute for HTTP route action, which defines things like forward to and things like that. So that's why we resorted to the HTTP route filter name. Uh, we definitely can use a better name. There are other names proposed, such as plugin or an add-on. Filter and actions are definitely out there. So we can see what fits best as to what our intention is for this extension point. So if we scroll down here, so the idea here is that you have the route filter, which is of a union type. So as you can see on line 199, we have the plus union decorator, or I'm not sure what is the technical right term for it. To tag, I think, yeah, the tag. This is in conformance with the union type kep that is present in the upstream enhancements repository. So we have the union type of kep. And then we have a union discriminator and types to identify what is the filter. So we have a question here. Let's get to the question a little later on. So if we scroll down here, uh, we have the type as the union discriminator, meaning whenever a user uses or initializes this filter, the type is a known string uh, based on which the controller can determine what is what filter is being configured here. Then we have two further extension points. One is an extension ref, which can point to a CRD. We also have a config, which we probably will remove, but this is meant for an inline configuration. similar to how we have annotations in the metadata core API. So the purpose here is you use an extension ref to define your configuration or point to your configuration that you want to execute. Let's say an authentication plugin, or maybe this gateway implementation is part of a mesh, so or like a service mesh, and you want to execute rate limiting or some custom filtering logic, because most proxies or most even gateways and cloud providers, you have like you accept a connection, you go through a bunch of filters, and then you forward traffic. That's more or less generally the way most implementation works. So this is meant for that. And at the bottom, as you can see, there will be some filter defined, such as HTTP request header transformer, right? So this defines concrete types for filters that will be part of the core or the extended group. So the core APIs, there will be some filters which will be supported by core, like adding a request header to a to a request that is flowing through the gateway is something that we want to be inside the core API, right? And we also want maybe traffic mirroring in the extended API group. So for those defined set of configuration, we want to have API types in the group in this package itself, and expose them via CRD. So you get all the benefits of uh, CRD validation, and use all implementation are using the same configuration. Um, and of course, you're free to extend it via custom resources as required. I think that's an overall summary. I don't think we have anything at the bottom. So yeah, one thing to note is we have this filtering struct. There are two places for extensions that have been introduced here. So if you scroll up, Rob, all the way into the route filter, yeah, scroll up a little more. I think, yeah. So here we have the filter at the route rule level, right? And we want to support this level of applying filters as core supported. So any of the core filters will be supported at this level. There is another layer of filtering which is possible in the forward tools, which are on a per target basis, right? So if somebody is doing traffic splitting and they now want to add any filters, they can add so here, right? So if traffic is forwarded to a version 1 of the service and version 2, different filters will be applied. And filtering at this layer, we are putting into the custom conformance level. This is definitely a little bit confusing, and I'm open to feedback here as to how to sort this. This is primarily introduced for, like, I think Knative requires this, the way they implement their sort of canary testing and rollout implementation they have. So, and there is value here, but not all implementation can support this. Um, yeah, so there's like filter definition itself and two places where they can be extended. That's all I have.
Yeah, thanks for that great intro. And that's a great point about where filters are defined in the two places here. And just to clarify exactly where these fit in, this first one is part of the forward to, and the second reference here would be a level higher in the actual rule, right? Along at the same level as match.
Correct. Yes.
Okay, and does that mean that filtering would be applied, the filters at this level would be applied before matching or after matching?
So those will be after matching, right? Because you can get to a rule only after there is a match. So it won't be
Okay.
like you evaluate each and every rule and evaluate each and every filter and then come to a match. A request comes in, you first figure out which rule, or the proxy figures out which rule is it matching, and based on that it can execute those filters and then execute the actions, right? And filters could also be executed on response, so that you execute an action, send the traffic upstream, get your request back, response back in. Maybe there are some response transformation or things need to be logged, and then you send that back request to the downstream client.
Okay. So it seems like both of these locations for filters are very similar then if they're both after matching then, forward to would come in inside this action, right?
Yes, Bowie is a robot.
Yeah, unfortunately. That is a very weird robot sound today, but unfortunately cannot make sense of that. Sorry. If you want to drop something in chat or rejoin or whatever, I can try to relay any messages. Um, so I guess the question I had here was if filters are, I guess why would you choose to define a filter in both places? Um, these locations seem very similar to me.
Yes, so the reason for that is sometimes you will be like selecting. So there is, receiving the request, figuring out which route is matched, and then the executing the filters and then selecting a backend, right? And then the backend can be different, right? And implementations have a hard time actually implementing, like after you select a backend and then execute a request, right? So that's what we refer to as, I think inside forward to you have two backends. I think Bowie you just opened up
Yeah.
a comment. So Bowie summarizes that pretty well. It's like do you want to do the filtering before the backend selection or after the backend selection?
Sure. Okay. So, okay, that makes sense. Um, and so the forward to the filters inside forward to are going to be defined after backend selection. That is the key difference. So this really only applies if you have multiple backends. Well, no, I shouldn't say it only applies, but it seems most relevant when you have multiple backends for the same match.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree there. I mean, if you have a single forward to, so if you have a single backend, then defining filter at either of those layers has no semantic difference, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Was there any additional feedback questions here?
Yeah, is there an order in terms of which filters will be executed first, like the route level or per target level?
Yes, so that's a good question. So the I try to think about ordering and figuring out like or imposing an ordering which can be respected across implementations is a little hard from my initial research. So ordering inside even in the same level as I've noted here on line 98 is currently undefined. As we get more experience with this, we will get uh, better at executing that. And ordering between the two layers, I think we should impose an order there where filters at the route rule level execute first, and then filters uh, at the for the backend level are executed. But then there can also be implementations which will override filters. So if you have a filter defined at the route level, the route rule level, and if you have a filter defined at the backend level, then the backend one takes precedence. And I've also seen those implementations out there. So it's the purpose here is to ship something which is something generic enough and extensible enough. So we are supporting filters at the route rule level in the core API, right? So if you have like a request header addition or removal feature inside this API, we'll support it only at the route rule level. Now it's up to the implementations to figure out how do they want to layer the ordering on it, in it, right? Because we don't even support filters in the forward to level in the core API. That's an extension point. So if an implementation doesn't actually support it, no ordering in place. But if somebody does support it, and then in that case, uh, you like it's up, you'll have to resort to implementation specific behavior there.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think there's great comments in chat as well from Bowie, who I think agrees with what you're saying. I think it's hard to impose order except for broad states, such as pre-backend selection versus post-backend selection. And then James is also referring to example YAML. Is that YAML in this PR further down?
Oh no, just if you scroll down to look at the weight field in forward to target, there's just a little inline example of forward to.
Okay. Okay.
To me, when I saw that, it's like, oh yeah, it made it seem more obvious that I would want to put headers in there because those headers are specific to a target.
Okay.
I think it's further up, Rob, if you scroll what James is referring to.
Oh,
Yeah, that's what I'm referring to.
got it.
We will likely revise post first implementations. That's a comment by Bowie.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, we do have to keep in mind that what we're aiming for here is an Alpha 1 API that has no backwards compatibility. You know, we intend to make breaking changes post Alpha 1. So yes, we can revise post Alpha 1 here. I really like this direction. I need a little bit more time to process it. One of my comments here was specifically around how large this type could be if every core transformation requires its own struct essentially here. I don't think there's a great alternative. It's just you know, nature of this kind of API, but something to watch out for, that if we end up adding a lot of core filters, this could be a relatively complex type in the future.
Yes, that's a very good point, and you know, like the CRD definition sort of blows up there, and
Yeah.
we also have to think about versioning there, because you know, in Kubernetes API is once you are at V1, you can add in features, right, which are backwards compatible. And we differentiate between, you know, what are the struct definitions in core.service inside Kubernetes 1.16 versus 18. Like we know how to differentiate that. In this version, if we hit V1 and we want to add in more core transformers, now like users have to go and update their CRDs, right? And okay, I have V1 installed in my Kubernetes cluster, but I'm trying to use this core filter, which seems to be supported, but the validation is erroring out. What do I do? Right, like those
Right.
user experiences is something we definitely need to think about.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So I commented on this yesterday, and just in terms of the, I guess in terms of the union, though, I seem to have not quite realized that a union was trying to be used. But and it's sort of three ways. I think it kind of comes out. I see what you're doing, and I just feel like it comes out awkwardly in the API because it's sort of three ways of doing the same thing, right? You have a HTTP route filter, and you have, oh, here's a built-in one, and here's kind of an inline one, and here's an out-of-line one. And it feels a bit, I think, without being able to enforce the semantics of a union, it kind of feels like, okay, we've got three ways of doing the same thing, and that ends up being kind of complex. And I wonder if this is a case where raw extension makes sense to be used. So raw extension would be similar to the config methodology, to say, okay, we'll just do that for everything.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so what is the difference between raw extension and like a extension ref that we are using, like probably is
So
different.
raw extension is just an inline, opaque inline YAML, chunk of YAML.
Okay, I see.
So it's basically, so it's more or less semantically equivalent to where you have the config field.
What I couldn't understand, and I thought that was an interesting idea, and I also am not very familiar with raw extension, but from what I did look into it, it wasn't clear to me if validation would be possible or meaningful on something like that, or is it really just indistinguishable from just a map string, interface kind of thing?
Yeah, you can't do you need a validation admission controller to do validation.
Okay.
Yeah, and Bowie comments that last time link cluster APIs tried to use raw extension, that wasn't
Yep.
good.
Yeah, that was the same feedback I got from cluster APIs. But I think in here, in this one, you've got three ways to do this. We've got basically got three different ways of extending of extending filters all in the same one, and it just kind of feels like we can't make up our mind a bit on it.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I think Rob has put the same comment. I think I'll definitely go take that feedback and revisit that.
And I don't really have like, oh, here, this one should be the way. So it's not. I understand it's not the most constructive feedback that I could give. But,
No, that's totally fair. I think that's the point of this specific PR is like it doesn't. It's pretty ugly, but it's like there are not a lot of alternatives, right? And that's where we get into constraints, but at least we hear the feedback and then take the best decision possible there.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it feels like maybe the best option is to stick with two options and potentially get rid of this inline config option, at least for now. So you have a clear differentiation. You have inline extensions, or inline filters, which are core, and you have an extension point, essentially, that allows you to refer to a CRD if one of the core filters does not meet your use case. And that seems to be fairly consistent with the rest of our APIs, where we have a standard set of core functionality and then an extension ref if what you're trying to describe doesn't fit into our core functionality. And then you're really just talking about two, but it's core and extended, and there's naturally different ways to do those two. I feel like that may be our best option available at this point, but I'm definitely open to other ideas.
Yeah, I do want to be mindful of time, so I don't know
Yeah.
if we should spend more time here.
You're right. I was just going to say the same thing. Thank you. And yes, we have lots and lots to cover. And the next one is from James, and it is about this is a follow-up to something like we discussed yesterday. And James, do you want to give some background here?
sorry. Yeah. So this is something I think, Rob, you brought up in the office hours yesterday.
Yeah.
That in the header match, you kind of have these matched pairs that you're supposed to provide together, but there was no validation on that. So when you want a path match, you really need to put both the path match type and the value, and they should both be provided, or neither of them should be provided. And the same semantics were for header match. So I said, okay, well, if we do that, then we would probably hoist them out as structs, and then what would that look like? It would look kind of something like this, I think.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly it. And I think one of the things that we realized yesterday was we have this default here on header match type. So it meant that anytime you applied the CRD, you are going to get a header match type set in your CRD that said header matching is exact. But then, you know, it would make it look like you were doing header matching, but then you had no headers specified, and it just seemed overly confusing and maybe not helpful. A default value here felt useful, but a default value, if you're not actually doing header matching, felt confusing. So I like this idea of pulling this out into a separate struct, so that this default would only actually apply if you actually went out of your way to apply header matching. You have an example down below that I think highlights this well, if I'm remembering the order of this PR. Yeah, okay. So you've got a match and headers, and you wouldn't even need to include this line because that would be defaulted. So you could do match headers, values, and etc. That seems like a reasonable addition to me. My only concern on this one, well, let me stop and ask others for feedback, because I've talked a lot here.
I do like this quite a bit because now extensions become easier. So if you have match, then you can have headers, paths, and custom or something, right? And then that becomes much more easier to read and comprehend as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So the one thing, and I am open to feedback here or ideas here, but one thing that I was a little hesitant towards was the way this is defined. It also splits path into its own struct, and that means that as this change is defined right now, everything is optional inside match. Nothing is actually required. How it was defined is a path type was actually exact, which is strange, and the default value was slash. So it would be relatively easy to get to a definition where the default path match was prefix and match all routes, which seems like a reasonable interpretation here. So if we can assume that every request coming into HTTP route has some kind of path, then it seemed reasonable to me to, instead of splitting this off into a struct, to leave this top level, leave the path matching specifically top level, and have defaults for both the type and value that resulted in matching all requests by default. So a slight difference, but at least that way your match has something set always. So there's not an ambiguous state where match can be completely empty.
I think my preferred change there would be to just say, if it's empty, an empty, would be either just say the path match empty is invalid, or to say if it's empty, it means match everything. The reason is that I think the reason we defaulted path match, the reason we defaulted the path matching originally, I think, was because when you add defaults, there's no real way to express that you don't want the match. So you have to choose a safe default. So it's kind of, it's just a little bit hacky, because if you just need to choose, because we're really just choosing that default because we didn't have a mechanism to not specify a path. So if we structify the header match, then I think we should probably structify both of them so that you can kind of treat them equivalently.
I think one of my concerns, that is a good thought. One of my concerns here is that our our simple use case, our simple API just added an extra level of complexity, right? So instead of match path bar, the most simple use case you can think of, you now have match path and then potentially type and definitely value. So you've added an extra layer maybe to the simple use case. I like in this example where you have everything laid out, it makes complete sense. But just if you're using the simpler use cases of I just want to match a path, that's it, then this does add an extra layer. Not necessarily the end of the world. Yeah.
Yeah, it does. It tends to default case into match path value instead of just match path.
Yeah. Okay, well, I encourage any additional feedback on this PR. I know we're running short on time here, but thank you a bunch for actually going through and cleaning this up. I am entirely on board with the header match changes and just need to think a little bit more about options for path matching. But yeah, thanks for the work on this one. And if anyone has any additional thoughts or other ways we could approach this, please add comments, whatever, to this PR. I added a couple extra things that are mine, but I'm going to skip over them and just briefly cover a couple things that we wanted follow-ups on. So Harry is working on TLS config as well, and we've already talked about this doc a reasonable amount. But specifically, I think Harry has requested additional feedback on the potential of having TLS config on routes, on HTTP routes specifically. Everything else in this proposal seemed to be generally, we had a consensus around it. This one was maybe a little bit less clear what we wanted to do here. I think one option is to file this in a separate PR and have a discussion there. But if before we got to that point, if anyone had time to read through this specific part of the proposal around route and provide any additional feedback or thoughts on how we could do this, that would be great, because I know there are some stronger opinions on whether or not this belongs. Yeah. And then the next thing I wanted to call out is I chatted with Jeremy just a little bit this morning, and he wanted just some clarification on what we wanted to do with SNI, this PR to add SNI to TCP route. There were some mixed opinions last time that we discussed this. I'm trying to remember the conclusion we came to. How I'm remembering it is there was some hesitancy that SNI really wasn't TCP, and so adding SNI to TCP route didn't necessarily make sense. If we wanted to add SNI, maybe it should be a separate route entirely. Does that line up with what others remember? Or what others think?
Yeah, I think that's was the conversation here. I do want to note, like, if we can get our TLS story going, and I'm going to open up a PR towards the end of the week, and then we settle on the things that we already agree on, and we get that merged in, and then if we can approach SNI route or an SNI matching with TLS config in route, right? They are not completely the same thing, but they definitely do relate a little bit. And then we can have like that discussion if we can hold until then. that would be more productive.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Okay, yeah, I'll add a comment here to that we can just hold this one until we get a little bit more progress on TLS, because I can see how there could be overlap there.
And
Yeah, I mean,
Damien,
a
if you were
TCP
trying
route
to
match
say
should be
something.
based on some kind of TCP headers, right?
I missed the beginning of what you said there, Damien, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, in PR 238, SNI is not TCP, right? So I'm just basically, I guess, agreeing and saying that a TCP route match should be matching based on TCP information, like TCP header information.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thought too is, matching based on IP information, but that's, IP is not really TCP. So then we get to a point where, okay, should we have IP routes that a TCP route uses? But that's, how far do we go down this road of segmenting the layers?
Right.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. So the way we decide, do we need a separate type for this thing, is do we have different rules for how you match a connection? Is that right?
And right now it's just based on kind of a protocol, right? So we've got the HTTP route that's based on HTTP information, TCP route that's based on TCP information, or should be based on TCP information.
Yeah, I think that makes some sense, because in the back of my mind, TCP or UDP, SNI, those are orthogonal. You could have UDP and TLS, TCP and TLS. But what you're saying, or what I'm getting from that, is we should be defining a new type if we have a different set of rules for how you match connections to that thing. So for SNI, you have server name. So you would want a distinct type where you can say match if the server name is this. And then I suppose your SNI route type would also have match on UDP or match on TCP, right? You would specify which transport layer protocol. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea.
Yeah, that also lets us kind of make a map of how do you reconcile when you have a TCP route and an SNI route and an HTTP route. You can define, it might end up being a little bit arbitrary, but you can define clear rules. For example, first we look at if there's a matching TCP route, and then we look at if there's a matching SNI route, and then we check if there's a matching HTTP, right? So, right, if theoretically a connection could match on HTTP host or can match on SNI server name, and you need some way of sorting out which takes precedence. And defining route types in this way gives us a way to clearly define what those precedence rules are.
That's an interesting idea. I mean, right now, I think we've scoped it so that you would be selecting a single route type at a time from a gateway. But that could be an interesting way if we did ever allow selecting multiple route types. Okay, well, this has been a very helpful. I know we're already over time, so I don't want to take much more time up here. If anyone is interested, I did had a couple issues here of suggestions, but we don't have time to cover them today. If you have thoughts or comments, please go ahead and add them to those issues. But yeah, that's all we have today. Thank you so much. I know we went a little bit over, But thanks to everyone for the great feedback and the great momentum we've got here. Excited to get an alpha API out soon. All right, have a great one.